Hey everyone, welcome to The Natural World Weekly, the show where we learn about the wonder of our natural world through science and animals. My name is Avery. I'm a biochemistry student here at UIC, and every week on this show, I'll walk you through a bizarre animal and an interesting natural phenomenon. And don't worry, you do not need to be a scientist or any type of STEM person to understand this podcast. I hope you all enjoyed this week's episode. Today, we'll be talking about the only non-human animal known to participate in complex farming/agricultural systems, and I'm going to explain the science behind my family's personal worst enemy, the breathalyzer. In your opinion, what's the greatest human innovation in our history? Some might say the internet, some might say like a medical thing. I would say a Crunchwrap Supreme and Mountain Dew Baja Blast. However, the innovation that arguably has had the biggest impact on the human species would be agriculture. When ancient humans around 12,000 years ago realized that growing crops is easier than chasing animals around, we started growing large patches of edible plants and society itself formed around them. This idea of coming together as people and growing food together may seem like a beautiful and uniquely human concept, but I'm here to tell you that it isn't. In fact, when ancient humans began revolutionizing agriculture, ants in South America already had complex societies around farming for nearly 60 million years.
Bruh.
These are the attine ants, or fungus-growing ants. Attine ants are a large group of ant species, about 240, that have one thing in common. They grow and cultivate their own food. They farm and harvest moss underground, which they then feed to a fungi that they also grow, and then they eat that fungi. To me, it feels pretty similar to humans, like growing grass and stuff that they feed to cattle, and then they farm and eat the cattle. It's pretty insane that they've developed such a human-like food system. And not only that, but they also have impressive farming efficiency and specialized techniques that are arguably on par with early humans. One prime example of their farming technique is in how they protect their plants from disease and pests. Now, they only grow a very specific moss and fungi in big patches underground, and in human agriculture, we've learned that when you grow a lot of the same crop closely together, they're more vulnerable to being wiped out by a disease or a pest. Say, for example, there's one type of ladybug that really likes a specific type of lettuce. Then if you grow a ton of that lettuce all together in one patch, rather than like dispersed among other crops, it's more likely that a ton of ladybugs are going to come over and just feast on all of it rather than like hitting one or two of your lettuce plants. The term for this is called intercropping, where you grow a ton of different stuff all like dispersed together in one crop, and it's really effective at protecting crops. However, most big farming operations can't do this since it's much more convenient and efficient to plant a bunch of one thing all together and, mow it all down with a tractor. And also most farmers specialize in only a few crops. Similarly, the attine ants can't do intercropping since they really only cultivate one type of moss and one type of fungi. And there's a parasitic fungus that feeds on their type of moss, so it is a real problem. How human farmers usually solve this is by using pesticides and herbicides, and fascinatingly, so do the ants. They actually naturally produce an antibiotic substance in their body that prevents disease and repels pests, and they spread this all over their crops as soon as they're planted. What's really fascinating to me about this is that their pesticide that they make doesn't have a lot of the same problems as human pesticides. Ours often are too potent and completely eradicate the target, as well as a lot of other helpful organisms unintentionally. However, theirs seems to be evolved to have specificity and balanced levels of toxicity, which I think is really cool and something we could maybe research to, change up our pesticides. Another scarily human part of their farming practices is the fact that they have fully domesticated the kind of fungi that they eat. Now, when a plant is domesticated, it's similar to like a domesticated animal in that they become reliant on the domesticator species to survive, which in every other case, I think the domesticating species is humans. Every plant that you eat from the grocery store is domesticated, whereas like, wild berries would be an undomesticated plant because they survive out on their own in the wild. The ants, fungi, and moss are kept isolated in their underground farms away from their wild counterparts, meaning that over time with evolution, the fungi lost its adaptations of survival and are completely reliant on the ants to grow and live. These ants have been around for so long and doing these practices for so long that the wild moss has actually gone extinct and only exists in its domesticated ant-reliant form. However, it's not just the fungi that's dependent on the ants. The ants have also evolved to become fully dependent on that specific fungi and can't really eat anything else. A specific example that shows us this is the fact that there is a specific essential nutrient that the ants have lost the ability to make themselves because the fungi provides it for them. This nutrient is arginine, which is an amino acid, and amino acids are little units that make up proteins. I bring this up because I want to emphasize how radical of a change this is. Every living thing, from plants to animals to even like bacteria, makes their own amino acids, and arginine is specifically one that we as humans don't need in our diet because we so easily and abundantly make it ourselves. As far as I know, these attine ants are the only animal that can't make arginine. I think it's pretty crazy that the ants uniquely have stopped making it because the fungi is super rich in it and they don't need it. Now, obviously, a pretty important question to answer is why do these ants do like all this for their food, especially when no other ants do this? We obviously never have like a completely straight answer for this kind of thing, and animals will do all sorts of crazy stuff to survive. But we do have a bit of research on this by a man named Dr. Ted Scholes, who is a legendary entomologist and the head ant curator at the Smithsonian. He's researched this pretty extensively, and he believes that the pressures of a global temperature shift around the same time that they evolved it forced them to get creative. The Earth, around that time that they evolved it, got colder and drier, meaning that the traditional ant gathering was not as lucrative as it used to be. And keeping a naturally regenerating food source that didn't mind dry conditions was a much more effective strategy for them with the new change. A note here, also, most of my info on these ants have come directly from the research of Dr. Scholes, so massive shout out to him and his team over at Smithsonian. Now, before we wrap up this animal segment, I do want to mention that there are a few other non-human animals that do farm, but they are nowhere near as complex as the system with the attine ants. However, I do want to shout out bees, beetles, and termites, who also grow their own stuff. I wanted to mention this just to make sure, I cover all my bases, but also just because I think it's so cool that so many different types of bugs are intelligent and organized enough to incorporate farming into their livelihood. While others aren't nearly into it and as advanced as attines, I still think it's a testament to how underestimated and intelligent bugs really are. I really enjoyed talking about attine ants. They're also, with dung beetles, one of my favorite animals and really cool insects. And I also loved preaching about bugs at the end. But now we're going to pivot over to the next segment about the science behind breathalyzers. I'm super pumped for this week's science segment as we're talking about the breathalyzer. It's an awesome invention that I have personal experience with as a chemist. I specifically chose this topic because it's a super interesting chemical reaction happening inside the machine that makes it work. And I love to talk about it because I'm really passionate about chemistry. Now, I know chemistry can be a super daunting subject, but I promise you can grow to love it. Take me, for example. I actually ended up with a D in high school chemistry, and now it is my favorite subject. Plus, for the purposes of this episode, it'll be a pretty basic overview. No worries, no need to feel daunting, or it'll all be good. So let's talk about the chemistry of alcohol for a moment. The alcohol that we drink, especially me, because, I'm super cool and with it, the active ingredient that actually gets you drunk is called ethanol. Ethanol is super versatile in its different concentrations. More concentrated ethanol is used for stuff like gasoline, hand sanitizers, and like vanilla extracts, different, extracts, while a very small amount is used for liquor. It all started when we figured out how to ferment stuff to make beer and wine. Glucose, which is a sugar in pretty much every living thing, is fermented down by yeast into this ethanol stuff, which is why we use plants like wheat and rye for beer and fruits for wine. Plants have, glucose, and that's what provides the ethanol. Every type of liquor, from vodka to tequila to Smirnoff Ice, has some sort of plant-derived ingredient in it that was fermented into ethanol. There's actually a lot of really interesting history and evolutionary theory about ethanol and the role it's played in human development. We likely evolved the enzyme that breaks it down in our bodies about 10 million years ago because human ancestors that are more closely related to us, they started living on the ground. So they'd be like eating old, rotted, fermenting fruit that had fallen down from the trees, as opposed to earlier human ancestors like orangutans who live in the trees with fresh fruit and, can't break down ethanol. But anyways, when you drink alcohol, your mouth, your throat, your lungs, your blood, really everything has a residue of ethanol, which is why we can use breath to test alcohol consumption. There's actually an exact ratio of the amount of ethanol in your lungs to your blood. For every 1 part in the blood, there's 2,100 parts in the breath. This is super helpful because before the breathalyzer was introduced in 1954 by a guy named Dr. Borkenstein, you would have to take a blood sample to know exactly how drunk someone was. And obviously that's not super feasible for in-the-field traffic stops. I think up until this point, people were just driving drunk, and it was pretty hard to really enforce the already flimsy DUI laws set in place. The field sobriety tests, like walking in a straight line, can certainly work, but they definitely aren't foolproof. I looked into this. A 1998 study with the San Diego PD testing the accuracy of 3 typical field sobriety tests ended with 24 wrongful arrests over the course of 297 traffic stops. They used all 3 commonly used tests and still falsely arrested about 8% of participants. And even if they were perfectly accurate, most of the tests rely on the subject being able-bodied, able to walk, able to move their eyes smoothly, etc. So the breathalyzer was really, really needed. But now let's talk about what actually happens inside a breathalyzer. Okay, so remember earlier, when you're drunk, you have lots of ethanol in your breath. The breathalyzer takes your breath and bubbles it through a mix of chemicals, and if there is ethanol present, the chemicals will react with it and make a new thing that the device can measure the amount of. More specifically, if ethanol mixes with the potassium dichromate inside, which is it's like an orangey solid crystal, the ethanol will turn the potassium dichromate green, and the breathalyzer measures how much that color changes, which I think is super cool. This whole thing is accomplished by photocells hooked up to a meter. Photocells are electrical switches that change electrical activity based on light levels. The reason why fancy outdoor lights that automatically turn on at night, the reason why they know to turn on is because they have photocells, which the dimmer light gets, they will produce more electricity. The photocells in the breathalyzer turn on more, the more green the mixture gets, and the more electricity that it produces, the needle in the meter that it's hooked up to will go forward more and more. It's calibrated really precisely so that this needle moves relative to how much ethanol is in the mixture. And then the reading from this needle is what actually tells you the BAC, or the blood alcohol concentration. There's also some other similar devices that use your breath to test how much alcohol is in your system. Specifically, there's one called an atoxylizer and an alco sensor, which I think are better names, but they have entirely different tech behind them. And from what I can tell, they aren't really used as much in the field. But if you are someone interested in chemistry, or you just thought this was cool and want to dive deeper and maybe read about more devices, I highly recommend reading up on these. And specifically, if you want, you can use source number 4 in the source list that will tell you more about those. But that's pretty much all I had for this week's science segment and episode altogether. I hope you all really enjoyed it. I actually really enjoyed researching this one, particularly more than usual. I had already known the basics with attine ants because, they're one of my favorite animals, but the breathalyzer science was all new to me. So yeah, this was really fun. I hope to see you all next week. Reminder that all sources will be linked in the description. And until next week, remember to stay kind and curious.